Dear guests, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon. We have a special guest today with us, Dr. Brendon Cannon from Khalifa University in Abu Dhabi, UAE. Thank you. Welcome, Doctor.
Well, thank you, Serhat, and thank you, Trends Research and Advisory, for hosting me today for this exciting podcast.
Most welcome. We are delighted to have you on board here. And this is going to be yet another episode in this special Trends series on trending echoes. And our audience will be able to watch it on YouTube in the next coming few days. And we'll be delighted to discuss with you today some of the hot topics, some pressing topics about the Indo-Pacific region, some of the great power rivalry, discussion on what's going on with regards to this U.S.-China positioning and their relationship with the Gulf, how it affects both global trade, economy, and geopolitics of our region. And your in-depth expertise, your insights will be very helpful in this regard, Doctor.
Thank you. Pleasure and honor.
Thank you. So let us start with our first question on a bit of background on regional geopolitics. How has the historical evolution of the Indo-Pacific region shaped the current geopolitical dynamics we see today? I'd like to add to that a couple of angles. So one is, how would you explain this growing arc of cooperation stretching from Europe all the way to, the Indo-Pacific to Southeast Asia? And do we see here a clash between these competing theories of Spikeman's Rimland versus Mackinder's Heartland? If you can please open this up a bit, we'll be glad. Yes,
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Happy to do that. Thank you. So I think what you're looking at is both a historical and a geopolitical and a political answer here. Yeah. So going back historically, we won't go back that far, but the term Indo-Pacific is really a new term that explains something that's been going on throughout history: the confluence of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Anybody who lives in Southeast Asia or that region, or anybody who lives here, frankly, understands that Indian Ocean into the Pacific Ocean civilization and trade element that was very much a fact of life up until the 1500s, when Portuguese and Europeans came into that basin and disrupted that, but then set up new networks. And so when Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe coined this term, Indo-Pacific, or actually picked it up based on a term that an Indian scholar had coined in about 2004, he was just adding a name to a civilizational and trade fact. Now, by a politician adding a name or adopting that name to a specific strategy and vision, of course, it led to a degree of politicization. And this is right where we see this free and open Indo-Pacific that Prime Minister Abe spoke about in 2016 in Nairobi in Kenya. And so this free and open Indo-Pacific is a vision of a free and open waterway, if you will. It's highly maritime, stretching from the Pacific Ocean into the Indian Ocean and back again. It's highly normative in nature. This is the way we want the world to be, rather than the way it necessarily is. Or it's a call to say, this is the way the world has been for the last 100 years. We'd like to keep it that way. All right. And so what's happened over the past 20 years, but really in earnest in the past 5, is that you're seeing actions and reactions, challenges, confrontations, cooperation within that Indo-Pacific sphere. If we look at the Eurasian continent in general, we're seeing the rise of what's termed a potential hegemon, to use geopolitical terms here, going back to Halford and Mackinder and Spikeman, these two great geopoliticians who wrote 75 to over 100 years ago. And what Mackinder talked about was a heartland in Eurasia, Central Asia, interior terrestrial Eurasia. And his theory said that if we ever saw the rise of a hegemon, right, an all-powerful state from that region, that this hegemon would be able to project power around the world and certainly control the Eurasian continent itself. Now, Spikeman, writing a number of years later, took that but shifted the theory a little bit and looked at what states in the so-called Rimland around the edge of Eurasia would do in the case of a rising hegemon. And so what's happened since the early 1980s is this meteoric rise of China, right? Economic power, political power, military power, et cetera, et cetera. It's a fact of life, right? And what we've seen in earnest, as I said, over the past 10 to 5 to 10 years is these rimland states stretching all the way from say, the UK down through the Mediterranean, across India, and then upwards in an arc towards Japan, moving, as Spikeman would say, to counteract that rising hegemon, which is China. Okay, and so one of the ways that can explain what we're seeing in the Indo-Pacific, this nascent cooperation between countries like Japan and India and the UK and others, is that rimland theory right there.
Mm-hmm.
This is a reaction to a potential rising hegemon in Eurasia itself. And that's kicked off all sorts of competitive dynamics, hasn't it? So on the one hand, we see the cooperation between countries like India and the United States, or India and Japan, that was non-existent 20 years ago or in its infancy, right? And on the other hand, we see the challenge or the increasing tensions that come with that cooperation as there are counteractions by other states that feel threatened by that cooperation.
Yeah, and I would add Australia to that as well. This important ring around, U.S. Pacific strategy against, China's growing influence in the region. But we'll come to those in a moment. I'd like to go back and talk about great power competition in the Pacific region, because it manifests itself conspicuously in this region, and the name gets, it comes from India. So let's start with the country that gave the name to it, India itself. Why is it called the Indo-Pacific? Because previously we knew it as the Pacific. Why is the Indian part, the Indian Ocean part, also important? Because India was the leader of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. What do you make of this balancing act? India's balancing act and hedging its position, like, say, for instance, defense technology partnership with Russia on one hand, but alignment with the US, Indo-Pacific Quad with Australia and Japan, and more recently the IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. Where is India? Where does it see itself in this emerging world order?
Well, it's a good question, Sarat, and I'm a security studies scholar, so I see, it's like if I'm a hammer, I see everything as a nail. So,
okay.
It's all about security at the end of the day. It's all about Indian security. So let me explain it this way. India very much was a leader of the non-aligned movement and still would like to remain a leader of a non-aligned movement or a global South, right, in today's parlance. And so it finds itself in an interesting balancing act constantly, because on the one hand, it is working willingly with partners such as Australia and the United States, which are very much a part of the West, right? And on the other hand, it wants to maintain those credentials, in fact, burnish them as this global South, right? Or what I prefer to term the political South, because there's many states that are part of the political South that aren't necessarily south of the equator, far from it, right? And so this political South leadership is contested right now. China is a would-be leader. India is a would-be leader. Brazil is a would-be leader. There are many others, right? And so the importance of that rising political South in terms of political power and say in the world is extremely important. And so India is finding itself pulled in a couple of different directions here. On the one hand, it has these omnipresent security concerns on its northern borders. On the one hand, Pakistan, right? But on the other hand, China. Okay. And the border in multiple places between China and India is contested. Okay. And this is really that factor that has driven New Delhi in the direction of what we call the Quad, or the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. And that's that informal club composed of India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. But this was a club very much of Japan's design, right?
Okay.
And back in 2007, it was Japan that approached India first to gauge its interest in a club about security that would potentially bring in the United States and then Australia. And India at the time was very wary of this. India had begun a little bit of cooperation with the United States as far as naval exercises in the 1990s, but India was no friend of the United States during the Cold War, okay, and vice versa. And so there's still that element of India would rather potentially work with other Asian partners, to include Russia, Eurasian partners. But its security situation, in some respects, pushes it or funnels it into a course of action, that is absolutely necessary for it, but is in contrast to some of its other aims as far as a non-aligned, huge growing power in South Asia.
I'd like to discuss a bit more detail about these different alliances forming in the region, especially the rising tensions in the Indo-Pacific, as we see, are due to different various push and pull relationships, as you touched upon, most notably because of the rivalry between US and China, each of which are trying to build alliances and grow their influence. Some examples of which are the Belt and Road Initiative, the AUKUS, Australia, UK, US Maritime Pact, IMEC we mentioned, and Indo-Pacific was also mentioned earlier. In this geopolitical map, where does the Gulf sit? Where does it find itself in this equation? Why is it important, this region, from both Washington's and Beijing's perspective?
Sure. Okay, yeah, so there's these interesting mini-lateral groupings that we're seeing, right? I mentioned the Quad earlier. There's AUKUS, which really has the elements of a true alliance, right? Because you've got three partners, Australia, the UK, and the US, that are alliance partners and have been for over 75 years. And so that is the only true alliance we're seeing in the Indo-Pacific, right? Right now. The BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is an economic as well as a political force, if you will, that China has been behind for over 10 years now. It's about infrastructure. It's about connectivity, right? And you have the BRICS, of course, which just added multiple members, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, and many, many others. These are not alliances. Again, these are groupings. These are talk shops, similar to the Quad. But again, talking about many things the Quad's not. Economics, connectivity, currencies, et cetera, et cetera. So where does the Gulf find itself in all of this, right? That's the heart of the question. And the Gulf is critical to the global economy, and it's increasingly powerful politically, right? And so therefore, what it does in this time of great power competition is really critical. And you see that, say, the major protagonists in this story, the big powers, China and the US, are heavily engaged here, right? The US for a bit longer than China, but this is the story, right, over the past 10, 15 years, that China really has become involved in the Gulf's economic fabric, right, in the way that European states and the United States have been for a number of decades now. And there was a major report that was put out by your think tank recently about a la carte nationalism. Okay, right. I'm sure you're familiar with it. And this is, I think, what we're seeing is that UAE or Emiratis or Saudis or others are really no different from their counterparts in Southeast Asia or in South America, where they're saying to their leaders, and the leaders fully agree, that, look, we don't want to choose sides. We want to have the best of both worlds. So in other words, we're going down the buffet table, and that looks tasty, thank you very much, but this also looks tasty, right? Even though it's competing plates, perhaps on the buffet table, to use the adage a bit further. And so right now, the Gulf can be said to be hedging, right? Strategically hedging. Its security partner remains the United States. Its economic partners, the United States, is still extremely important, but again, it's increasingly China's increasingly important to it as well. Of course, the Gulf, as much as it's diversified its economies, and it's diversified its economies massively, it still sells hydrocarbons to East Asia, and that is the primary export market for Gulf hydrocarbons. Oil from the UAE, gas from Qatar, et cetera, et cetera. And much of this goes to China, South Korea, Japan, but also India, right? And so it's critical for Gulf states that the challenges coming from this great power competition do not bubble over into more than a challenge. What's not wanted is a conflict. And I think that Gulf states are very invested in working within all of these multilateral bodies in a way of not only enmeshing themselves, right, from Europe right across Eurasia to East Asia, but also in being able to work within those forums to perhaps try to limit tensions between these great powers.
Is this multi-alignment or this, let's say, quest for strategic autonomy a viable path in the long term? And the reason I'm asking is because it sounded as though it's a bit of a transactionalism also, rather than building steadfast alliances, diplomatic engagement, and so on. It's more about, okay, what do you have I can get, and here is what I give you, and this kind of, shopkeeper mentality, kind of transactionalism. Is this a viable long-term strategy for the Gulf in this emerging great power rivalry?
Well, let me pull out my crystal ball and I'll answer the question about the future, but I seem to have left it in my house this morning. Look, this is anybody's guess here, but I would say that the relations that the Gulf states like the UAE are developing are far more than transactional.
Mm-hmm.
I think that this is far from a shopkeeper mentality. Rather, this is there is a real eye amongst the leadership here at the country's future, its future stability, its future security, its future welfare, right? And so therefore, it sees that it sees multiple partners and a growing list of partners, right? Mm-hmm. So the list was quite small 40 years ago. It's an increasingly long list of partners for different things. Okay?
Yeah.
So look at the Gulf relationship with Turkey, for example.
Yep.
Look at the Gulf relationship as it's changed over the past 10 years with India. Okay. Look at those relationships it's developing with Central Asian states. And so while you could look at it and say, well, this is just about making money, et cetera, it's more than that. It's that government to government. It's the bureaucrats getting to know each other. It's getting affinity for one another. And so that really does speak to something more than transactional. Where those allegiances are going to go in a time of conflict is another question.
Right.
And we're not going to know that until a conflict. And that is normal for states. It's not just Gulf states. It's all states in the international system.
Right.
Beyond those of a certain bloc, let's say, like in the West, right, which has been definable for the past 100 years, given dynamics within Europe and the North Atlantic, which are unique. Most states are intent on avoiding a major conflict, and that's for much beyond transactional purposes.
Yeah.
And B, will only deal with that issue when it actually occurs.
Okay, and let's come to how the U.S.-China rivalry manifests in the region since October 7 attacks. China is making inroads into the Middle East, Africa, and West Asia to circumvent what it perceives as a U.S. policy of containment around choke points like the Suez Canal, Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and Malacca. And U.S. has positioned several carrier strike groups in the region and shown determination to maintain its role as a security provider for the wider Middle East, which until recently was in question. Correct me if wrong, but I mean, U.S. since Obama era, former U.S. President Obama's era, U.S. had announced this pivot to Asia strategy, 60-40 ratio of its naval presence in the Pacific versus the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. How do you see this shift now since the attacks? And if you can dissect these recent conflicts in Gaza, Red Sea, and the Bab el-Mandeb using this great power rivalry lens that you just described, that would be great.
Sure. Big question. So I think one of the really interesting dynamics that's come out of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and I'm talking pre-October 7th here, is that we saw China actually taking sides. China's been very famous and famously says that it doesn't deal with internal state issues of other states, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't get involved in the politics of country X, Y, or Z, right? And ipso facto, please don't get involved in China's own affairs. And so you could quibble and say, well, this is not an internal affair. Israel-Palestine. These are two separate states. But that belies facts on the ground, and we know that this complicated reality is very problematic. And so I think that the role that China has played after October 7th is one that is not surprising in many respects, given its interest in that global or political South leadership stance. Okay, but it's also hasn't been very vocal, right? It's offered to a couple of times to attempt to bridge the divide, develop a peace plan, et cetera, et cetera. And this is not developed into anything, not necessarily because China hasn't wanted to, but because of dynamics on the ground. China is concerned about these choke points, but it's less concerned about the Bab el-Mandeb than it is about the Strait of Hormuz, of course, and the Malacca Straits, et cetera, et cetera, for obvious reasons. And so while some of the oil flowing from Yanbu and other places goes through Bab el-Mandeb, goes further east, the main issue for China is the Gulf. And so it has been able to sit back as things have developed in the Red Sea, and it doesn't have to make any noise about what the Houthis are doing as far as attacks on ships. The U.S. is in a little bit different position. So there is its frankly problematic support of Israel in all of this. But beyond that, there is an element of if the U.S. doesn't do something in the Red Sea, then the question is who is going to do it? And there's been a lot of commentary recently about, well, the U.S. is acting because otherwise a vacuum will be filled. And I think the common narrative is that China would fill those shoes, if you will, would fill that vacuum, right? But China's unable to do that. It is building an increasingly large blue water navy, but it does not have the capabilities, nor does it have the rationale to fill that vacuum. And so what we're seeing in the Red Sea is either the U.S. acts, and it's damned if it does, or it doesn't act, and it's damned if it doesn't, right? And so this is a sticky situation for the U.S. And it's problematic on both the regional level, right? Even though Gulf states in general, I think, are supportive of some kind of pushback against the Houthi because of the disruption, right? And so there's many here who are breathing a sigh of relief, like saying at least we're doing something, right? But on the other hand, on the great power competition side of things, China can sit and do nothing and potentially come out looking quite good out of all of this.
Okay.
All right. And so, the U.S. finds itself in a bit of a conundrum. The other problem, too, is that just like the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, and now this Red Sea issue, all of this takes away from what the U.S. really wants to focus on, which is the Indo-Pacific and Asia. Okay. And of course, it expends resources doing so. Critical resources that will be used in the event of a conflict, a great power conflict, which all of us are hoping doesn't happen, but nonetheless is always the eventuality since we plan for worst case scenarios. And so, the U.S. finds itself in a terribly tricky situation here. And I assess that going forward, you're going to see more of the same, right? Kind of so-called surgical strikes against Houthi sites because there's no appetite for greater confrontation, and then hopefully a push along with that to limit and then end this conflict in Gaza, which will then take away some of the rationale that Houthi are using, at least the propaganda element of what they're using. That's not to say that the strikes by the Houthis won't continue, because there is benefits to them from this.
Okay, and so just to summarize, we see some of these conflictual situations continue in the near term, and until they settle down in some kind of an equilibrium where sides are ready or more open to talking and negotiating a settlement, including maybe some partnership from the Gulf states, some contribution to rebuilding Gaza. We read from the news that there are negotiations happening also with regards to some normalization in the region, and we'll see how that manifests and how it affects China and U.S. presence in the region. But U.S. is here to stay, from what I understand, that its military presence, its security guarantees and relationship with the Gulf states is rock solid. It's not going away, unlike what some commentaries had mentioned, that U.S. is withdrawing from the region, drawing down. It's actually not going anywhere, that it's here. But China is also slowly, but with a long-term vision, trying to build its economic partnerships and maybe turn this into some kind of a security arrangement in the long term, if I understood right. How that will be affected with a possible conflict down the road between the two great powers is something to be seen. That it's a long-term thing that we're not yet ready for it in here. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, Dr. Cannon?
Yeah, well, just going on what you said there very quickly. Yeah, I think that the narrative of the U.S. drawdown in the Gulf is probably overplayed. The U.S. maintains the preponderance of force in this region for a variety of reasons. One is the security assurances it has with Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, etc. Okay, and it's fundamental. One is also just for positioning of force for an element of control of what's called the global commons, the maritime global commons. Okay, and so maintaining fleets in different spots around the world is very essential to all of this. So there's multi-tiers here, and we talk about this at the Khalifa University in our classes. We discuss security in the Gulf and regional security, and the U.S.'s role here. And what I always say is there's a debate amongst scholars out there about what the U.S. should do vis-a-vis the Gulf and the Middle East in general, right? Withdraw, stay, etc. With camps arguing both sides, but there's really not a lot of debate within Washington itself about this.
Okay.
And so I think that needs to be remembered because it's domestic politics in the United States that's going to decide what happens. And this doesn't seem to be an issue, at least at this juncture. That could change, of course, with the elections results in November this year.
So it's not a priority right now?
No, absolutely not. And remember, this is all part of the Indo-Pacific at the end of the day. We often overlook the fact that the Western Indian Ocean basin is a critical part of the Indian Ocean. And as you mentioned, China sees this very much as the case, with its naval base and military facility in Djibouti, but also its BRI projects within Africa, and particularly East Africa.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. And so, having written about East Africa for a number of years, this is also a zone of competition for Japan is there, India is there, the United States is there. Of course, the Gulf states are there, Turkey's there, etc. And so this is really the situation in the Gulf. It's mirrored in East Africa and elsewhere, is that you've got a whole host of players. We tend to focus on those great powers because that's where the most tensions are. But there's a whole host of actors that rate just below that in terms of power that are acting in these regions as well. And we see this in the Gulf again. This list of potential partners is lengthening. And that's a good thing for this a la carte way of conducting foreign policy.
Does that mean there is a multi-layered world order emerging? That is, the two great powers at the top, and below that is the layer of middle powers, so-called these multi-aligned middle powers hedging their bets, as you explained, from the Gulf to Turkey to Africa. And then on the third layer is perhaps these least developed countries or developing countries in the group of G77, which, by the way, is having another summit this week.
Right.
Is this a possible explanation of the emerging world order, do you think, this multi-layered order?
Yeah, I think it is, at least for the time being, right? And so, and this actually seems to be beneficial at this point for just about everybody involved, to include the G77 plus China, which of course is happening in Kampala in Uganda right now. But again, the concern, not only here in Abu Dhabi, but in Tashkent and in Brasilia, is that what happens in that time of conflict? Does this all snap shut, right? This multilateral, this multipolar order, right? And that's the concern right now is we've got an economy that's emerging from the wreckage of COVID-19. We've got trade that's in some respects rebounding. We've got this interlocking system of minilaterals and multilaterals, the host of which you mentioned, and everything's looking pretty good. But overlaying that all is that international structure, that anarchical international structure, where nobody can enforce security and therefore states have to do it themselves. And in a time of great power conflict, states will inevitably get drawn into that conflict. And that means falling on one side of the fence or the other, and that is everybody's nightmare.
Okay. With that, thank you very much, Dr. Brendon Cannon from Khalifa University in the UAE. Thank you for being with us today.
You're most welcome. It's my pleasure.